So Heidi, I asked you to come and talk with me today because I know you have an incredible just testimony of what God's done in your life through a lot of hard things. People might look at you and your family, you radiate a lot of joy, and so they might just assume that you've had this perfect life, but just like everybody else, it's a real life, and I know that you have had some experiences with deep grief and some suffering over the course of your life.
Yeah, that's right. And when I was 20 and my sister, who was only 13 months older than me, was killed in a car accident, my world changed forever at that moment. And I went into a season of just intense grief and pain and sadness that lasted a very long time. And even though it's been many years since her death, I still grieve her loss so much, even today. And it was, and still is, a very hard road. Another deep grief that I've walked through is when my husband and I found out I was pregnant. And at the time we had 2 boys, and life just seemed to be going so well. And I went to the midterm ultrasound, and the doctor was like, "This baby is the picture of health." And we found out at that appointment we were going to have a little girl. And so my husband and I were just so excited and so happy, and we couldn't wait to just welcome this precious little girl into our arms. And a couple of months later, the baby stopped moving. And soon after that, I gave birth to a stillborn baby girl who we named Elizabeth Grace. The doctors couldn't give any medical reason for her death, nor could the autopsy. And so it was just a very dark and difficult season. And more recently, we had a very good friend and neighbor who committed suicide. And that's been a very challenging, difficult path to walk in the past year with his absence and all the pain that comes with suicide.
That is a lot of loss and just brokenheartedness that comes out of grief associated with death. But I know that you've also endured a lot of suffering in another way in your life, and that's part of your testimony and your faith shaping as well. Could you say a few words about that?
I suffer from a chronic illness called migraines that has no cure. And as you know, anyone with a chronic illness, there comes a lot of grief that you walk out with a chronic illness. And there's the grief of the pain itself and all the intensity of the pain and debilitation that comes from the chronic illness, and the grief of never knowing when the next migraine might hit and all the milestones that you have to miss in my family's life and important events that I would love to be at but that I can't be at times. And there's also grief that comes when you know that you might not ever be healed this side of heaven. And at times people have said some very wounding things such as, you're not healed because of your lack of faith. And that can be very hard to take in at times. And so the migraines have been a very difficult burden for many years. I started having them when I was about 4 or 5 years old and have about 14 or 15 migraines a month. And I've tried all kinds of remedies and medications with very little relief and all kinds of painful side effects. It's been a grief that at times crushes me.
So part of what I know that you've gained through all this, and it's a hard story, a lot of it, there's a lot of good parts to your story too, I know, but what you've gained is just some real wisdom and a heart to understand how the church can make a difference for people when they're suffering. And so just from the personal standpoint of what you've learned and then how we could help minister to people who are hurting as a church, what would you tell people?
Well, I think it's important to let people grieve and give them all the time they need to heal and not try to rush that healing. You know, sometimes the church can be the hardest place to be when you're in the midst of grief and everyone seems so happy and healthy. I just remember after losing our daughter that the flowers and the cards never seemed to end. And people came alongside of us and encouraged us and prayed for us and really carried me when I was too broken and wounded to even want to leave the house, and very apathetic at the time in the midst of deep grief. And their love and faith just carried me to Jesus. Through all the seasons of grief, I've just found a new depth and intimacy in my relationship with God that I know I never would have had without walking through the suffering and pain that I have. And each grief is different, and I often ask God, why, God, why? But I know in the depths of my being that I can trust His heart of love for me and for His people, even though there's suffering and pain and a lot of deep grief in this world. And it causes me to reflect on the book of Job. And there's a time in Scripture where Job is talking to God after all this horrible pain and grief he's walked through. And he says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. In other words, I thought I knew you until I walked through all this pain. And now I know you on a whole new level, a personal level. And that is my cry of hope for the church, that we would take the grief and pain in our life and that we would know God intimately and personally through the grief, that we would understand God on a whole new level, and that the church would come alongside those in grief and carry them when they need to be carried the most and point them right to Jesus.